Now, first of all, what that's going to do is it's going to raise rates for every business in the country. And all of a sudden, a business is no longer going to be able to borrow its money at 3% like it can now. It's going to have to pay 7 or 8 or 9%. Or if it currently has to pay 6%, it's going to have to pay 12. And that means the fixed cost rises. And they got to raise their prices. And it doesn't matter if their sales go down. They got to cover their nuts. And in addition to the interest, you have taxes. Obama's saying he's going to repeal the Bush tax cuts next year. He just proposed 3 points in addition to that. So he's going to drive the federal rate up to 43%. And the cap gains rate will go from 15, not to 20, like he said, but to 22.5, the extra to pay for his health care. So as those costs rise, those tax increases happen, that fixed cost also is going to rise. And who knows what's going to happen with energy prices. But when your fixed costs go up, you got to raise your prices, and you get more price going up, and fewer people buying the product and the service, and you get not just stagflation, you get depression and inflation at the same time. And that is what we're headed for it inevitably. The other thing that it does is right now we have a $4 trillion federal budget. And because I'm borrowing money from my friend here at 3%, I only have to spend $300 billion a year of that on debt service. But you raise my interest rate up to 7, 8, or 9, and I'm going to have to spend 700 or 800 or 900 billion a year on debt service. Now, to put that in perspective, the total take of the personal income tax for every American combined is $900 billion. So we're going to have to spend like every penny we give in income taxes simply to pay the debt. It'll be 3 times as much will go to debt as goes to Social Security. And a third of that interest goes out of the country. So it'll also have a huge effect in drying up buying power. And every single one of the things I'm talking about, every single one, is the byproduct of Obama's screw-ups since he took office. Because if he didn't launch this stimulus package for $800 billion, and he didn't launch the supplemental appropriation for $400 billion, and he didn't send out the TARP money as it was being repaid in new spending, and he didn't spend the $200 billion that's walking out of the Treasury as we speak, we wouldn't have this deficit. Obama's walking around saying he wants a bipartisan commission to advise him on how to cut the budget. Well, I'll tell him how to cut the budget. You got $500 billion of stimulus money you haven't spent. Don't. You've got $500 billion of TARP money that's been repaid that you're about to spend. Don't. Presto, I just cut your deficit by $1 trillion. And I avoided this interest rate trap that we're headed for. I avoided all the scenarios that I just sketched out to you. But he's not going to use this crisis to shrink government. He's going to use this crisis to grow government. And we are going to be suffering with the results of that. And it is just horrific. Now, how do we get out of the situation we're in? How do we get out of the national debt that has risen from $9 trillion to $12.5 trillion in 1 year? The answer is inflation. Not inflation as a result of a mess up by the Fed, or inflation as a result of the Secretary of the Treasury not knowing what he's doing. Inflation is a deliberate act of government policy. So the $12.5 trillion is only worth $9 trillion. And all of a sudden the debt increase didn't happen. It was all illusory because you're inflating the currency. And those 3 elements, demand pull, cost push, and a deliberate inflationary policy to repay the debt and bring down the deficit, are what we are facing in this country today. Now there's a constructive answer, there's a real easy answer to it. That is, we can enact the best tax, the most productive tax that has ever been passed by a government. It's called a tax cut. When you cut taxes, you increase revenue. George Bush cut the rate for the top group in the population, the top bracket, from 40 to 35, and the top 1% of the country increased its share of total tax payments from 37% to 40%. Increased it. Wait a minute, didn't I tell you they just got their rates cut? And they generated an average of $100 billion a year extra in additional tax payments after their rates were cut. The point is that when you cut the rates, you stimulate the economy and you increase your tax revenues. When I worked for President Clinton, we would spend months, hour after hour after hour, going through the federal budget line by line, talking about what we were going to cut. And we'd sit with Gingrich and negotiate it, and back and forth and back and forth. And finally, we reached a deal where maybe we could balance the budget over 8 years. And in the course of that deal, Gingrich and Trent Lott, the Senate Majority Leader, came to Clinton and said, we want you to cut the capital gains tax from 28 to 20. And he opposed it, Hillary opposed it, but it was their price and they had to go along, and I had a hand in helping persuade him to do it. Because they cut the capital gains tax from 28 to 20, so much money flowed in that we balanced the budget in 18 months. Wow. And I didn't have to wait 8 years, it took a year and a half to do it because of what it stimulated in the economy. So this genius in the White House now is raising the capital gains tax from 15 to 22.5, despite the fact that every time you raise the capital gains tax, your revenues drop. And that's the same thing that he's going to be doing with the tax code and repealing the tax deductions and repealing the tax bracket cuts of the Bush administration. But if the Republicans took over, it is very simple to work our way out of this. Cut taxes and generate revenue as a result of that. But at this point, we're headed in the exact opposite direction at 100 miles an hour. And unfortunately, like Lazarus rising from the dead, the health care proposal is back on the table, but in a new, improved form. First of all, it's going to be paid for by a 3% tax on everybody in this room. 3% tax on the rich. And as they always do with this stuff, they set it at a certain level, but then they don't index it for inflation. And particularly with the inflation that's coming on, even if you currently don't make $200,000 a year, you will very soon. Now, it'll only be worth the money you now make if it's less than 200. But inflation is going to drive it up, and we're all going to end up paying that tax, plus 5% more, which he's going to raise in 11. So the federal rate will go from 39.6 to 48. And then on top of that, you have 2 points for Medicare, be 50, and you don't have it in Florida, but the average state and local tax is 4%. It'll effectively mean a 54% tax bracket in the United States. That will move the United States from 27th of the 30 industrialized country in the world to 4th in the percent of tax paid on each marginal dollar of income. And Obama's going to do that and is going to push it through. But the real problem with the health care reform is not financial. There are two fundamental reasons why Obama is pushing this proposal. And he can't say either of them in public. He can't admit to either one of them in public, because they're both massive no-nos. So we get this rhetorical scream that's going on. The first is, the biggest item of waste in our healthcare expenditure is the $50 billion a year that is spent in the last 8 weeks of a patient's life. Take it out to the last year of a patient's life, and it's $100 billion a year. That's out of about $400 billion spent on Medicare. So about 15% of Medicare is spent in the last 8 weeks, and about a quarter is spent in the last year of a patient's life. And most of that money is wasted. The guy dies anyway. And he has a horrible quality of life while you're keeping him alive. So it makes no damn sense to spend that money. Unplug the machine. Cut off the chemo. Don't do the open heart surgery. Let him stay in a wheelchair. Don't give him the hip replacement. The guy's going to die anyway. And that is the philosophy behind the Obama health care.